black, a child is white. The whole world looks upon the side, a beautiful sight.
It is now my distinct honor and privilege to have on the phone Dr. Grace Vuoto. She is the executive director of the Edmund Burke Institute, one of Washington's premier conservative think tanks. The Edmund Burke Institute publishes a monthly magazine, Reflections, of which, in name only, I am the editor. I don't really have any real power. My wife and my sister-in-law do, but let that go. And we have now come out with a new issue of Reflections, and Dr. Vuoto has a very provocative piece. It's already making the rounds. People are this is already starting to catch on. It's about the need to end race talk in America. Dr. Vuoto, Dr. Grace, welcome to the Kuhner Show.
Hello, Jeff. It's great to be on. Thank you for having me.
Welcome back, Dr. Grace. You're a big, the Kuhner country loves you.
Jeff, I have to say, my only wish is that you no longer are a salaried employee but become paid by the word. Because I am just amazed at how much traction, how many words per minute you spew out on every issue, including Ray coming for dinner.
Isn't that what your mom used to say about me?
Yes, and I insist that you be paid by the word from now on.
She used to say that if you got paid by the word, she said you are the wealthiest man in the world.
I agree.
So, all right, now, so let me ask you this. You got this provocative piece, the need to end race talk in America. Why do you think there's too much talk about race, and why do you think we should end it?
Well, Jeff, candidate Obama promised that he was going to be a post-racial president, and that really struck a chord with his voters and even others who may not have voted for him. Many thought, well, at least we can begin to put this issue behind us. Instead, ever since he's become president, all we're doing is talking about race to the point that it's become a completely meaningless and fruitless discussion. My point is that race talk nowadays, unlike during the civil rights era, it no longer has a really beneficent purpose. It's basically being used as a club to try to silence opponents. It's basically absolutely irrelevant. And one of the things that I point out is that if we're going to use the word race, we have to use it correctly. To be a racist means to believe that some people are biologically inferior to others. And this was a conviction that was held for centuries. It was especially prevalent during the 19th century and then during the early parts of the 20th century. But by and large, now there are very few people in America or in the West who believe that others are biologically inferior.
I mean, with the exception of what? The KKK and the new Black Panther Party, correct?
Exactly. So there are a few, but as far as we know, they don't seem to have an impact on public policy. So there's no piece of legislation, for example, now on the books that is discriminating according to race. So when we talk about it, what exactly are we talking about? We're talking about an abstraction. And the more we talk about an abstraction, we're feeding into a leftist mindset. So my argument is, as conservatives, we should not be fueling this fire. We should say we conservatives no longer discuss race unless there is a specific policy that is, in the public square that addresses race. Otherwise, it's just an abstraction, and then we're feeding into the leftist worldview.
Okay, now, I have two follow-up questions, Dr. Grace.
Yes.
One is, give me some examples of where race talk is being used as a club to beat or vilify or smear or destroy an opponent. Give me some concrete examples, and what is this leftist mindset that all this talk about race, all this race talk is fueling? What in particular about the leftist worldview is in fact absorbing all of this race talk?
Okay, well, the examples, Jeff, they are replete in the mainstream media. MSNBC journalists like Matthews and Keith Olbermann and Rachel Maddow, they are constantly saying that the Tea Party is racist, that, for example, opposition to Obamacare was racist, that If we ask about Obama's birth, we're racist. In other words, basically disapproval of Obama is tantamount to some kind of racism within the American people. And that's what we've heard really over and over again by the left. It's been so frequent that now I think many of us are just immune to the discussion. We're not even able to hear the word properly. And regarding your second point, how does this fuel into the leftist mindset? Well, think about it. If we no longer discuss race, don't we make the left increasingly irrelevant? They basically have two issues that they are basing their political power on. One is sexual permissiveness, so try to make everyone as sexually permissive as possible. And the other is to be a champion of so-called victims, based on this idea that there is widespread racial discrimination in American society. So I think the more we talk about it, the more we're lending credence to what is tantamount to a lie, because in actual fact, there is no public policy out there that is promoting anything racist as there was during the civil rights era. So, in fact, we're talking about nothing. And the only reason we're talking about nothing is because the left needs to perpetuate that lie that there is such a discussion that must be had in order to justify their very existence.
So, in other words, as we've seen under the Obama presidency, as we've become more polarized politically, ideologically, and racially, you are saying that it's playing right into the left's hands. The more we talk about race, the more we talk about this alleged sin of racism, the more we talk about whether the Tea Party movement is racist, or whether conservatives are racist, or whether opposition to Obama is racist, all this race talk, all it does is fuel tensions, which fuels the left and the agenda of the left, correct?
That is 100% correct. So that's what I'm saying. It's time to end the race talk, and conservatives have to be very shrewd. Don't fall into that trap. It's a trap. If somebody accuses us of being racist, instead of going in a tit-for-tat, I'm not racist, this isn't racist, and going into a prolonged discussion, my recommendation is to say something very simple. I love all God's people equally, and I only talk about policy and culture, period. And you end the discussion. The more we end the discussion and the more we focus the discussion on practical policies, we will win the national debates. And the left will be left to talk about race amongst themselves, and they will become increasingly irrelevant because it's a topic that in the daily lives of Americans is increasingly irrelevant. Now, that's not to say that talk about culture is invalid. I think to discuss culture is extremely important. And bear this in mind, that say amongst any group like African Americans, there are so many variants of culture within that group. For example, you have one generation that likes a hip-hop culture, but an older generation often dislikes that culture and thinks it's contrary to African American interests. So I think talking about culture is really valid, and I think talking about policy is really valid. But for all practical purposes, race talk is now passé, and conservatives should be wise enough to recognize that and to just stop feeding this leftist fire. One of the things I read in the piece, Jeff, and this comes from my long experience as a married woman, sometimes in a marriage, you have to know when it's time to let a discussion go. And you realize that ultimately there's more common ground than there is division, and that the issue is just not worthy of a prolonged discussion.
I've been talking to Dr. Grace Vuoto, Executive Director of the Edmund Burke Institute, and Laura Dana Vuoto, a.k.a. Lori Vuoto, Communications Director of EBI. We'll be right back with the mailbag here on the Kuhner Show.